all. As we wait for some of our stragglers to come back in, I'm gonna talk a little bit and fill some speaking time. So, one of the challenges we often hear around how ESG investing can be better measured, with the advances in technology, machine learning, and data science, they've all emerged as techniques that can help evaluate performance. I'd like to welcome Katrina Nichols, who leads our Asia Investing and Real Estate News, to moderate and invite her panelists. Katrina's going to be actually taking care of the next two panels, so you won't see me for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone here today. So the panel that I'm going to be helping out with is a really interesting one, slightly different to the ones that we've had before. It's going to be talking about AI, machine learning, and big data, and how those three things can be used to evaluate ESG and get a grip on all the extensive troves of data that is available in this area. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Andreas Feiner. He's the founding partner of Arabesque and the CEO of Arabesque Estre, all the way from Germany. Helene Lee, the CEO and founding partner of GoImpact. And last but not least, Vadim Kanofyev, the quantitative researcher, and he's with Bloomberg from New York. Thank you. Thank you all. So perhaps I can just kick off with a question for Vadim, fellow colleague. I just wanted to ask, how is big data being used for sustainable investing, and what's Bloomberg doing in this regard?
Yeah, right. Thank you for the question. So I would say that every time when we're talking about the ESG-themed investment strategies, we are always working with big data, and there are two main reasons, I would say, why that data should be considered as a big one. The first is literally the size of the data set with which we will work in. Because, for example, if we're talking about some broader market indices, for example, Russell 3000, we're going to have 3,000 companies. Then for each of the companies, it's going to be hundreds of different indicators, and then a few years of data, which could be quarterly, monthly, and in some cases, when it is some sentiments, it would be weekly or even daily data. And if we multiply everything, we're going to get hundreds of millions or maybe even billions of data points. So it's a really huge data set. And the second point that I want to mention is the nature of the data. Because when we're comparing the ESG data with some classical fundamental data, it's going to be completely different because it's diverse data. There are different types. So for example, if we're talking about the emissions, then it's going to be some continuous variable, whereas when we're switching to the number of members on the board, it's going to be discrete numbers. And then if we're talking about, for example, how frequently the company is conducting some safety trainings for the employees, it's going to be categorical data. And finally, when we're looking at some data which is coming directly from news and some other data feeds, it's going to be textual data that cannot be used directly with the first three groups. Without some preprocessing. So to sum up, it's completely different data set. It is big. It is different. It contains different types of data. It is not non-structured. So yeah.
Andreas, there's obviously an immense amount of data that goes into the top of the funnel, if you will, for Estre. I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with Arabesque and Estre, so perhaps if we could start off talking a little bit about why you developed Estre, who the main people are that you developed Estre for, and how you ensure that the data is as scrubbed and as clean as it can be.
Yes, absolutely, with pleasure. First of all, thank you so much for having us here. So Estre stands for Sustainability in X-ray, and it basically says that we want to look beyond the skin of a firm in a similar way as the X-ray does with a human being. And Estre was a starting point of the asset management business that we had lifted out of Barclays in 2013. So as a background, in 2010, a group of executives came together to launch a new fund management firm out of Barclays after BGI was sold to BlackRock. And then in 2012, when the LIBOR crisis happened, obviously it was not the best time to launch an asset management firm and lecturing other people on governance. So we bought it out of the firm and then launched it as an independent firm. And in 2014, we started relatively naively with one data provider as our starting point to create an investment universe. But then what we found there is that once we bought more and more data from other data providers as well, is that the correlation between the assessments of those data providers was not really high. And you can also see this now with the MIT project, which is called the Aggregate Confusion Project. So what they found is that the two dominant ESG data providers have a correlation of 0.15, which is obviously something that is troubling if you want to kind of invest money as a fiduciary. So what we did is, like out of the own necessity of being a fiduciary, we started to add more and more data. And the other point that is kind of a question mark that we always had is kind of the annual nature of the data points that we are being delivered from the traditional ESG data providers. So we added news. We're ingesting more than 30,000 articles a day, and we're looking into NGOs, more than 6,000 NGOs of them. And for us, it was then important to have a daily lens. And this is how we got S-Ray into the asset management business. And we never intended to have a separate firm for that. But since we avoided a couple of the ESG accidents, we have been asked by more and more customers to basically just give them the information rather than to run the money for them. Then we said, okay, well, our mission is to help mainstreaming sustainability. And if you measure this by the amount of capital that you can actually touch, then obviously making that data available to others is directly paying into our mission.
Helene, you come at from a slightly different angle, looking at the amount of private capital that has begun to flow into this area. But one of the blockers for private capital flowing into this area is that the data is very fragmented, and investors actually need something that's a lot more ordered. So where does GoImpact come in this regard?
Right. Actually, GoImpact was born a little bit out of frustration. Being a management consultant by training, working in banking, asset management most of my life, it's actually painful to watch how difficult it is to mainstream the agenda, and I think part of that, data is one thing. I want to echo also a lot of the other panels before that touch on two things. It's better to have no data than poor data. And what you can't manage and measure, it can't grow. So, in order to make it easier, GoImpact was conceived as really as an ecosystem builder, to try to connect the dots, but really around the two major pillars of learning. An uninformed investor would invest very little. So until you can actually have learning modules that are relevant, piecemeal, bite-sized, easy to digest, so that's what we're building. And also connecting the dots. You see me speaking at a lot of these contexts. Now, the interesting thing is I do see there's a particular sector as a lower hanging fruit and two tailwinds behind this. Okay, that sector, of course, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, hugely important to move the needle, as we have seen in the cases of Japan for Asia. Okay, because GPIF has committed as an investment strategy to dedicate a certain percentage of their asset allocation into ESG funds. So the overall AUM in Asia just jumped because of that. Total AUM of ESG. Now, mind you, the ESG definition varies. So we need to put in a little bit of disclaimer on that. So family office, family capital is the lower, I think, hanging fruit because they don't have such a huge fiduciary responsibility, it's their own capital, and if there's a way to make it easier for them, you can actually try to mobilize that capital in a much more readily accessible manner. The huge tailwind was actually the regulators, because regulators, not just the regulators that regulate asset management companies, but also listed companies, the exchanges. We see that disclosure around ESG for listcos is actually becoming more and more of a real kind of demand by the regulators, but also many of the monetary authorities are actually having a lot of initiatives behind that. So hopefully tech and capital can become the twin engines to drive this.
Andreas, are you seeing much of an audience for the product that S-Ray delivers in the private capital markets among family offices?
I mean, there is demand in private markets, definitely, but there is very little data available for private markets. So it's something that is in the making, and we're actively working on this with a couple of partners, but that is something we can only announce next year.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that S-Ray can help investors avoid train crashes. Can you give some examples where that has been the case? Some practical examples?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, thank you. How can we even say that a train crash has been avoided by Arabesque in itself? So we're a very modular investment process where at the beginning we have certain thresholds whereby we include a company in the investment universe or not. So what we can show is that we haven't included Volkswagen, we haven't included Valiant or Toshiba or Sun Edison or Danske Bank or Facebook and a couple of the others for various reasons ranging from a combination of corporate governance issues or some environmental or social issues.
Vadim, I also wanted to come back and ask, what are some of the best practices in your experience of analysing such big data sets?
Yeah, right. So based on our experience and what we saw that when we're working with such a big amount of data, it is really important to understand it and to have a proper toolkits to analyze and visualize this data. So because let me make a step back, and so when we're talking about the ESG data or any other fundamental data or financial data, mostly we will be looking at the three-dimensional data set where one dimension is list of companies, second dimension is list of fields, and the third dimension is time. And so what we want to do is to slice and dice this hypercube and to see the distribution, the nature of the data along different axes and different hyperplanes. So what we're trying to do, so for example, if we're fixing one stock and one field, then we're looking at a time series of those characteristics for the company. Or alternatively, if we decided to fix one date and one field, then we are looking at this distribution of the data, which is also very important for our analysis. And then once we really have this grasp on the data, we can continue preprocessing it and preparing for the further analysis. So for example, if we saw that the data is really skewed, then it might make sense to transform it, for example, taking log, so that we're shifting our attention from outliers to the whole data set, and we are able to get more interesting information from that.
So what role do AI and machine learning play in the analysis of all the data that you're getting in the door?
Right. So once we have the data normalized and aggregated, so what we can do is to use some machine learning techniques in order to find some interesting patterns in the data. For example, we can use some clustering analysis, where we partition this huge multidimensional data set into subgroups so that in each of the groups, the companies are similar based on some of the ESG characteristics. And then it might be interesting to overlap it with some other groupings which are more classical, for example, market capitalization or some sectors. And it could give us some insights into the real causes of these differences between the companies.
So how do you rank a company where they're not producing the data? Do you extrapolate the data that you have on other companies and think, well, they're in the same sector, so therefore we will put them there on the scale?
It's a good question. So it could be completely different approaches of dealing with such problems. For example, if we are employing some factor analysis, then we are trying to aggregate some characteristics which are kind of similar and describing some similar theme within ESG. And then if one of the companies are not publishing all the characteristics, but at least some of them, we can still extract this information and then use it for our analysis. And even we can impute the values based on these hidden factors that we're able to identify in the data.
Okay. Andreas, S-Ray has developed a temperature score. Can you explain what that is? And I was also quite shocked to read, probably on some of the information on your website, that 25% of the world's 250 largest companies don't report any admissions data. It's 1/4, so that's a really high amount. How do you handle that in the temperature score? So what is it, and how do you deal with companies that just aren't complying?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the temperature score came out of a frustration that we had, again, from kind of how currently emissions data is usually handled. So if you go to a data provider and ask them, okay, how many companies do you have scope 1 and scope 2 or scope 3 data for, and then you'll get a massive data set. And then you kind of really make the effort to look into how many companies have reported data. Actually, you will find that it's only about 2,500. So kind of there's a lot of estimations of scope 1 and scope 2 data. So one of the frustrations that we had is, like basically with estimation, so that we can put it into quantitative models, we are basically taking away the allocation function of financial markets. Because financial markets should be able to allocate capital into companies that are better run or that are less carbon intensive in their production. But since we are kind of mulling this over, we are basically taking that opportunity away. So we haven't had a kind of a carbon lens for a very long time, and we got a lot of criticism, or I got a lot of criticism within the firm, obviously, for not having something like that. But we're looking for the right tool. So we sat down together with a consultancy. We came up with a methodology. The consultancy was PwC, and we came with a methodology that we said, okay, we would like to take the actual data that has been reported by a company and combine it with a science-based targets initiative. So you would like to basically show that a company has the idea and also a credible plan to reduce the emissions. And if we just go kind of on average, every company needs to reduce its carbon footprint by 50% in order to land at 1.5 degrees. So this was to us important because, and then we know how much we need to, we still have to spend in terms of a carbon budget to reach the 1.5 degree scenario from Paris. And we can then bring this back with the curves from the International Energy Association so that we can calculate for each and every company that has reported a carbon budget. And then when you compare the carbon budget with the actual emission the company had, you can basically, under the condition that everybody were to behave in the same way, you can basically say which degree world are you actually in. And then you can do lots of things. To my mind, it's the first impact measure that you can actually use in portfolio management. And it's something where you can give your portfolio a temperature, you know, how hot is your portfolio? Or if you talk to a company, how cool are you? So you can do lots of things with that.
And the companies that aren't giving any emissions data?
They are, we have like various temperatures for that. So it's 1.5, 1.7, 2 degrees, 2.7, larger than 2.7, and 3 degrees. And a company that is not reporting is getting a 3-degree scoring. And it's about the reporting that has been basically come up with from the TCFD, which obviously Michael Bloomberg is a big part of. And the TCFD has come up with the way how carbon should be disclosed by financial institutions or for financial institutions. So if you don't do that, then basically you have a 3-degree scenario for your company.
Helene, the investor base that you're mainly dealing with, how attuned would they be to something like this temperature score? And I also know you've got GoLearn and Go Network, so can you give some examples of how they also provide intangible value?
Sure, happy to, and thank you for the question. Actually, I really like that description, just now. We should be talking a little bit more about it. Because, for a long time in the private capital, mobilization space, people struggle with having metrics that actually measures net impact rather than just by exclusion or mitigation. And then if it's just by exclusion or mitigation, people don't really compare apples with apples or oranges with oranges. So when you talk to investors that have huge capital to deploy, if you can't answer those questions or doesn't have a framework to answer those questions, it becomes almost like a dead-end discussion. So what we are trying to do is actually hopefully to work with more companies like Arabesque, and also to try to drive this at a very basic level, bite-sized, because investors are typically busy, family offices are busy, gatekeepers are busy. So they need to look at this at what they are most passionate about. If we talk about the 17 SDGs, impossible to train anyone on that completely. So what GoLearn, the platform learning module, does is we break it down into like 3 or 4 different thematics, and we find the commonalities. And then we turn these things into bite-sized chunks that we are collaborating across the board with different people in Asia particularly to drive this and to make it user-friendly. For collaboration, I think really is, as we were just saying, the whole point about us, our work is to make ourselves redundant almost in a way that, the term of sustainable investments in the future hopefully will become redundant because every investment would be a sustainable investment.
You mentioned the gatekeepers for family offices, and they have a slightly different reaction when you're talking about ESG to perhaps the younger generation who will ultimately be the beneficiary of the money, given we are seeing this great intergenerational transfer of wealth happening in Asia. So what's the difference in outlook between the two?
Actually, it's very complicated dynamics between the intergeneration transfer. If you look at it, you know, the 32 trillion or something that was thrown about, that will be transferred to either millennials or even Gen Z over the next 15, 20 years. The readiness are totally different. And also the dynamics in the families are different. So I think it's not just about influencing the young. It's not just about influencing, you know, the next geners. And I did tons of next gener programs in my banking days. It's also about understanding how to bridge that with the capital creators, the wealth creators, what the dynamics are. And I think there's a lot of learning and education, and again, you know, building the tools that hopefully will get them there.
And I guess it would be fair to say that the younger generation would probably have a better understanding of AI and big data and what those terms are, which, you know, weren't commonly used, you know, perhaps even 10, 15 years ago. Andreas, I also wanted to ask how the company deals with conflicts of interest. For example, you know, some organisations you're taking data from and then you're using it in S-Ray, and then, you know, you potentially are in conflict with, at the other end, with the clients who gave you the data because you're selling to the same client base. So how are you addressing those issues?
Yeah, so again, the history of where we came from, you know, like we have been a data aggregator because we worked with one data provider, and then we added and we added and we added. And then we got the question to kind of provide that information, and that was happening in 2017 in April. And obviously back in those days, since you have the kind of the contracts with those customers, with those data providers, you need to be in touch with them and tell them what you're up to do. And we did that, and then we had the launch of Arabesque S-Ray, and after which the customer or the data providers that we have in there were perfectly fine with that. And obviously at some point in time, you know, like once you get more and more successful, basically what happens is that you change your data providers over time. And this is absolutely possible because we are not taking the assessments of any data providers, we're taking the raw ingredients. So it doesn't really matter whether we receive those ingredients from one data provider or from the others. So there's certain turnover that happened, but this is something that we have expected, and that is kind of completely normal when you kind of transition from a customer more and more into a competitor. From the customers from ours, you know, we're not getting any data in that sense. We're not reselling any data of our customers, so there's no inherent conflict of interest, to make that absolutely clear. So we are ingesting data from data providers, which is raw ingredients. We are looking for our own data with our technologies, and having more and more of a data set that we are building ourselves, which is obviously something that we can do and we should do in order to corroborate the validity of the data, which is obviously a very important topic if you kind of use that data in a fiduciary manner. And then from customers, we do not take any data which we then resell. That's not happening.
Is there any difference in Asia with regards to the source of the data? I mean, are you seeing more innovative sources of data, ESG data in Asia?
I mean, there is, what we do in S-Ray, we take company disclosure, but we also take news and NGOs, and increasingly more and more we are looking into social media and more the patterns of what is happening in social media on companies. So these 4 dimensions are the same everywhere. Obviously disclosure in Asia or in emerging markets in general, and less in frontier markets is kind of, you know, like it's not as much as you would find in developed markets, but that is a transition journey. So in order to have an S-Ray score and an assessment that we are having, you need to have a corporate disclosure yourself. And then only we can supplement this with the information that we are finding somewhere else. So you wouldn't get an S-Ray assessment from us when you have no disclosure yourself.
Mm-hmm. Vadim, perhaps you could talk about some of the innovations that you know, you're seeing and also Bloomberg is seeing in the use of AI and machine learning when it comes to ESG analysis.
Yeah, right. It's a very good question because the landscape of the ESG data is changing, and as we heard during our previous discussions and panels, that there are more and more push to build in some more regulations to structure this data so that probably the question of missing data will not be that important, and the question of finding some hidden features in this data and factors would go onto the first place. Also, as Andreas just said, there is more push to look at the social media and news, and this is something that I believe that it's going to be further, because once we're building better algorithms and building some relationship maps, we are able to extract better data. So, for example, if for each company we know the list of all the directors and executives and the products which it is producing, then once in any social media we have some news about one of the products, we can relate it to the company, and as a result we can have more information about what's happening.
But I mean, you know, anyone can jump in and answer this question. On social media, there's an awful lot of fake news. We all know how easy it is for social media to be manipulated. If you're trying to extrapolate data that is true, especially for something as important as ESG, how do you navigate that?
I think it's a combination of many things. It's not like one thing happens and then kind of you take a conclusion and this is the absolute truth. You know, like what you try to find is, if you find, let's say, something incredible news, such as Bloomberg, where you have somebody saying something happened at a company. If you then at the same time you find an increase in social media in the patterns of people looking up that company or looking up that topic, then this is something that gives you an additional hint, almost like a seismograph, whereby you can say, okay, well, okay, there is something that must be to it, at least it generates a lot of interest. So that's kind of how we look into this, and it's more like a corroboration tool rather than, okay, something happened here.
Helene?
So there are two angles I think that is interesting about this, you know, despite all the real news, fake news, and everything. First, companies, corporations, listcos, are increasingly reacting to criticisms, okay? So by the way they answer some of these questions, if they are being challenged, it also tells a lot, you know, about the real data, the genuineness of the initiatives. So that's one way of social media looking at. Secondly, because of social media in the past, say 5-6 years or so, really, there's a group of KOLs or influencers, you know, key opinion leaders being developed. Now, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but many of these provide quite a bit of content, you know, and knowledge into the specific verticals in which they are, you know, opinion leaders on. So you can actually, you know, crawl quite a bit of information on particular topics around that and how that matches with the companies, what they are disclosing, and so on. So these are like two main things. You know, I'm reasonably active on social media, so I use that actually as a kind of a pulse check, you know, as well.
Vadim, can you use technology to distinguish between them, or is there always going to be a human element where you have to kind of use your own emotional or just intelligence and your judgment to sort what's correct and what's not?
I'd say that at the moment still we need some human judgment because the technologies are not there yet, because yeah, as we just discussed, so we need to take into account some different factors which might look minor in the sense like the amount of information, but we know that that information should have more weight because of from where it is coming, for example. But in general, so once we are evolving and our models is going further and we have more and more information, probably at some point we would be able to get rid of human interaction and just to get good results from the computer.
Hopefully not too soon. Well, I think we are just about out of time, so please join me in thanking the panelists here today. Thank you.